In the blazing summer of 64 AD, when flames swallowed the so-called Eternal City, people swore they saw a shadowy figure standing against the inferno. That figure, they claimed, was Emperor Nero himself, singing as if the disaster was nothing more than his personal stage performance. But who was this man, really? The ruler who turned the center of the civilized world into something closer to a haunted theater? To answer that, we need to dive into a story so dark, so soaked with blood and betrayal, that it makes you question just how far power can twist the human soul. This is not just a tale about a cruel ruler. It's a study in how absolute control can warp a man into something less than human, something monstrous. Nero's reign didn't start off drenched in blood. At first, it looked full of hope, but slowly, step by step, it rotted into a nightmare. A reign remembered as one of the most twisted and corrupt in Roman history. His very name would eventually become shorthand for cruelty. His legacy was carved not in marble, but in ashes, poison, and spilled blood. The boy who would one day become the most infamous emperor of Rome was born into a world where family meant almost nothing compared to ambition. In the Roman court, poison bowls were served with dinner, children plotted against parents, wives arranged the deaths of husbands, and sons watched their mothers die by schemes they themselves had set in motion. Nero didn't just learn from this world, he mastered it. He didn't just repeat the sins of his family, he outdid them all. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy later known as Nero, entered the world on December 15th, 37 AD, while his great-uncle, the notorious Mad Emperor Caligula, was still in power. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero's path to greatness seemed almost guaranteed. But in truth, the path he walked was paved with schemes, betrayals, and blood. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, died when the boy was only 3 years old. That left young Nero in the care of his ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger. Now, Agrippina wasn't your typical Roman mother who just stayed in the background. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula, the daughter of the much-loved General Germanicus, and above all, a woman whose hunger for power seemed bottomless. Imagine mixing political genius with the cold heart of an assassin. That was Agrippina. At one point, she was exiled by her brother Caligula for alleged adultery and plotting, but like a spider waiting for her moment, she returned to Rome once Claudius took the throne in 41 AD. She wasn't just beautiful, she was dangerously clever. Ruthless, cunning, and willing to play the long game, she knew exactly how to bend the rules of the empire to her will. Growing up under her wing, young Nero learned fast. Instead of watching gladiators for entertainment like other Roman boys, he was watching his mother seduce Emperor Claudius, manipulating him step by step until she became his fourth wife in 49 AD. Nero also saw her destroy her rivals one by one, removing anyone who might get in her way. For Nero, murder wasn't some shocking crime. It became normal. Just another strategy, another tool in the political game. What's a dagger in the dark when it gets you closer to power? For Romans like Agrippina, and soon for Nero, this was just everyday business. Under Agrippina's guidance, Nero's education wasn't about becoming a good man. It was about becoming a useful weapon. She arranged for the philosopher Seneca to be his tutor, not because she cared about virtue, but because Seneca owed her his career. The irony was thick. One of Rome's most respected moral teachers was now training a boy who would grow into a monster. At the time, neither Seneca nor anyone else realized just how terrifying this child would become. To make sure Nero's path to the throne stayed clear, Agrippina knew she had to deal with Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. The boy stood in her son's way like a wall. If Claudius kept favoring his own bloodline, Nero would remain a pawn, not the emperor. So Agrippina got to work. First, she convinced Claudius to officially adopt Nero in 50 AD. That way, Nero could be groomed as heir, while Britannicus slowly got pushed to the sidelines. By 51 AD, Nero was given the title of Princeps Juventutis, leader of the youth, a signal to Rome that he was next in line. Claudius, already aging and possibly weakened by years of subtle poisoning, seemed easy to control in Agrippina's hands. But that still wasn't enough. Britannicus had to go. The final act of Agrippina's plan unfolded in 54 AD. Claudius, who had ruled for 14 years, suddenly dropped dead at a dinner party. The official story said indigestion from mushrooms killed him. But historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio weren't buying it. They pointed their fingers at Agrippina herself, whispering that she slipped poison into his meal with the help of a professional killer named Locusta. Yes, Rome actually had famous poisoners who worked almost like celebrity chefs, except their recipes were deadly. With Claudius gone, the empire suddenly had a new ruler, 16-year-old Nero, the youngest emperor Rome had ever seen. The Senate, faced with no real choice, confirmed him. He wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was now draped in the purple robes of power. But this wasn't some innocent boy getting lucky. This was a youth who had been sharpened into a blade by his mother's scheming, manipulation, and ruthlessness. The Senate probably thought they were just dealing with another young, pliable ruler. What they didn't realize was that they had just unleashed a storm. At first, things looked surprisingly positive, with Agrippina hovering like a watchful hawk and advisors like Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus guiding him. Nero played the role of the dutiful emperor well. His speeches to the Senate promised respect, dignity, and even a return to the good old days of Augustus. For a moment, Romans thought maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to suffer through another Caligula-style nightmare. But Agrippina wasn't satisfied being in the background. She hadn't clawed her way back to power, eliminated rivals, and orchestrated Claudius's death just to fade quietly into the shadows. She expected to rule through Nero, to pull the strings while he wore the crown. And that, as it turned out, was her biggest mistake. She had created a monster. But now the monster was starting to resent the hand that fed him. Barely a year into Nero's reign, the blood started flowing again. His first target was none other than Britannicus, the boy he had grown up with, Claudius's true son, and the last real threat to his throne. Though only 14 years old, Britannicus's very existence gnawed at Nero like a constant reminder. You're not the real heir, you're just adopted. If left alive, the boy could become the rallying point for anyone who dared to challenge Nero. So Nero decided it was time to remove him once and for all, and he did it in the most public, theatrical way imaginable. At a dinner party in 55 AD, Britannicus was served a cup of wine, which, like all imperial food, was pre-tasted for poison. No problem there. But when he complained that the wine was too hot, the servants added cold water to cool it. What Britannicus didn't know was that the water had been laced with one of Locusta's signature poisons. Within minutes, he collapsed at the table. His body shook violently, foam spilling from his mouth as the toxin ravaged his nervous system. Guests gasped in horror as they realized they were watching the emperor's stepbrother die in real time. And what did Nero do? Did he panic? Did he mourn? With a chilling calmness, he told everyone to relax and insisted that Britannicus was just having an epileptic seizure. Then, as if nothing had happened, he ordered the dinner to continue. Imagine being at that table, knowing you just watched a prince get murdered, and being forced to pretend it was business as usual. Rome had officially entered a new nightmare. Britannicus's murder wasn't just about eliminating a rival. It was Nero's way of showing independence from his mother's control. It was his declaration that he was in charge now, not Agrippina. The message was loud and clear. If Nero was willing to murder a child at his own dinner table, then absolutely no one, family or not, was safe. And so with Britannicus dead, the boy emperor began his transformation into the blood-soaked monster that history remembers today. After Britannicus's death, Agrippina began to realize the monster she had raised was no longer her obedient son, but a young ruler who had tasted blood and liked it. She had spent her whole life mastering the deadly game of Roman politics, but now she faced the most dangerous opponent of all, her own child. At first, she tried to hold on to her influence, reminding Nero that she was the one who had put him on the throne. But instead of respecting her, Nero started to see her as a threat. The mother who once taught him betrayal and poison was now in danger of becoming his next victim. That's the kind of twisted Roman irony people whispered about. Raise your son to be a killer, then act surprised when he tries to kill you. Their clashes grew sharper when it came to Nero's personal life. Agrippina hated his affair with a freed woman named Acte, calling it disgraceful and beneath the dignity of an emperor. She wanted him to act like Augustus. Nero wanted to act like a spoiled celebrity. She scolded him for singing, racing chariots, and performing on stage, things a Roman emperor simply did not do. But Nero didn't care. The more she nagged, the more he pushed back. It was less mother and son now and more like two rival gang leaders living under the same roof. The final straw came when Agrippina threatened him directly. She reportedly snapped at Nero one day, saying she could easily replace him with another family member. She even hinted that if Britannicus were still alive, she would have backed him instead. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. From that moment, Nero knew what had to happen. His mother had to die. But killing Agrippina wasn't as simple as killing Britannicus. She wasn't some defenseless boy at a dinner table. This was a woman who had survived years of intrigue, exile, assassination attempts, and scandals. She was careful about her food and drink. She kept loyal guards around her, and she never let her guard down. Straight-up poisoning? Too risky. A sword in the back? Too obvious. So Nero came up with a plan that was equal parts genius and ridiculous. He ordered a special boat built, designed to collapse and sink while Agrippina was on it. Yes, the emperor literally tried to turn his mother's death into a stage play. It sounds insane, but this was Nero. In his mind, every crime had to be a performance. He invited Agrippina to the resort town of Baiae, pretending he wanted peace and reconciliation. Smiles, dinners, fake warmth, the whole act. She boarded the specially built boat, unaware that it was basically a floating death trap. The ship was rigged so the deck would suddenly collapse, sending her crashing into the water to drown. A tragic accident, or so Nero hoped. But like many of Nero's big ideas, the plan fell apart. The boat didn't collapse the way it was supposed to. Instead of dramatically plunging his mother to her death, it just kind of tilted and broke awkwardly, leaving people scrambling around in confusion. Imagine trying to pull off the perfect murder, only for the trap door to get jammed. Agrippina wasn't fooled. She realized immediately what was happening, and instead of panicking, she swam for her life. This woman had survived Caligula. Did Nero really think a leaky boat was going to take her out? She pushed through the water and made it to shore, soaked but very much alive. Meanwhile, her companion Acerronia wasn't so lucky. In the confusion, the attackers mistook her for Agrippina and killed her on the spot. When word reached Nero that his mother had survived, he was horrified. Can you picture his face? The great actor-emperor had tried to stage the perfect death scene, and his main character just walked off the set alive. Not only did the murder fail, it failed spectacularly. And now Agrippina knew beyond a doubt that her son wanted her dead. Cornered, Nero panicked. No more theatrics, no more collapsing boats. He ordered his men to finish the job the old-fashioned way, with swords. Soldiers were sent to Agrippina's villa that very night. When they arrived, Agrippina knew exactly why they were there. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. According to the stories, she even bared her stomach to the soldiers and told them to strike there first, because that was the womb that had carried the monster now sending them. Dark, chilling, and defiant to the end. And so, Agrippina the Younger, the woman who had clawed her way through blood and betrayal to place her son on the throne, was hacked down by his orders. A mother murdered by her own child, the ultimate taboo in Roman society. Even in a culture soaked in violence, this crime shook people to their core. Rome had seen plenty of emperors kill wives, brothers, and cousins. But your own mother? That was beyond human. Nero, however, felt no guilt. If anything, he seemed relieved, even proud. He had killed the one person who still held power over him. With Agrippina gone, there was no one left to rein him in. He wasn't just an emperor anymore. He was a free monster, unchained, ready to do whatever he pleased. Rome had no idea what kind of horror show was about to unfold. With Agrippina out of the way, Nero felt unstoppable. The leash was off. No mother breathing down his neck, no one left to tell him no. And what did the Emperor of Rome decide to do with this newfound freedom? Did he strengthen the empire? Lead the armies? Fix the economy? No. Nero decided he wanted to be a celebrity. He didn't just want to be emperor. He wanted to be admired as a singer, an actor, and a chariot racer. Rome expected its emperors to command legions, govern wisely, and embody dignity. Nero? He wanted applause, encores, and roses thrown at his feet. In his mind, he was the star of the biggest show on earth, never mind that the audience had no choice but to clap. Senators who once commanded armies now had to sit quietly in the theater, pretending to enjoy their emperor's off-key performances, or risk losing their heads. It was less Rome, the eternal city, and more Rome's Got Talent, starring Nero. And if you think that's embarrassing, wait until you hear about his love life. Nero's first wife, Octavia, was the daughter of Claudius, a political match, not a love story. She was popular with the Roman people, elegant and dignified. In short, she was everything Nero wasn't. To him, she was boring. So naturally, he turned his attention elsewhere. Enter Poppaea Sabina, a married woman, no less, the wife of his friend Otho. Poppaea wasn't just beautiful. She knew how to manipulate Nero's ego. She whispered poison into his ear, fueling his resentment toward Octavia. Before long, Nero was parading his affair around openly, as if daring the public to judge him. In a city where scandals were practically breakfast gossip, even Romans were shocked at how brazen he was. But Poppaea wasn't satisfied being a mistress. She wanted the throne, and she pushed Nero to make it happen. So, what did he do? He accused Octavia of adultery. Yes, the same crime he himself was guilty of, and had her banished. Not long after, she was executed on trumped-up charges. The Romans were horrified. Octavia had been beloved by the people, and now her innocent blood was on Nero's hands. One wife down, but Poppaea got what she wanted. She became empress. And for a moment, Nero seemed genuinely happy. He flaunted their marriage, indulged in her every whim, and acted as though he had finally found his perfect partner in crime. But love with Nero was always a dangerous game. By 65 AD, Poppaea was pregnant with their second child. During an argument, historians say over something as petty as him returning late from the races, Nero snapped. In a fit of rage, he kicked her in the stomach. The blow was so violent that both Poppaea and her unborn child died. Just like that, the woman he had claimed to adore was gone, killed by his own foot. And the worst part? Nero didn't seem particularly broken up about it. Sure, he staged lavish funerals and pretended to mourn, but deep down, this was just another casual atrocity in his ever-growing list. The emperor, who had already killed his brother, his mother, and his first wife, had now added his second wife and their child to the tally. To Nero, murder was becoming just another Tuesday. The imperial court grew darker and more unpredictable. Guests never knew if they were being invited to applaud Nero's new song or to watch someone executed. It was like living in a haunted theater. One moment, music and laughter. The next, blood and silence. The senators whispered that Nero was less an emperor and more a serial killer in royal robes. And yet Rome played along. Because what else could they do? If the emperor wanted to be cheered as a singer, then cheer they must. If he wanted a standing ovation after strangling his wife with false charges, then applaud they would. In Rome under Nero, survival meant pretending the nightmare was normal. And frighteningly, the longer it went on, the more normal it began to feel. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, disaster struck. A fire ignited in the shops lining the Circus Maximus, the huge chariot racing stadium at Rome's heart. At first, it looked like just another small blaze. Rome had plenty of those, but the winds fanned the flames into a monster. Within hours, the fire was tearing through crowded neighborhoods, feeding on wooden homes, oil lamps, and chaos. For 6 full days and 7 long nights, the city burned. When the flames finally died down, 10 out of Rome's 14 districts lay either in ruins or reduced to ashes. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless. Families sifted through the smoldering rubble, looking for loved ones or clutching the charred remains of what used to be their lives. The Eternal City looked less like a capital of empire and more like the wreckage of a nightmare. And then came the whispers. People swore they saw Nero watching the fire from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy, while the city burned below. It didn't matter that the fiddle hadn't even been invented yet, or that Nero was probably in Antium, 35 miles away when it started. The image stuck. To the Roman people, it felt true. Their emperor wasn't a savior. He was an artist treating their suffering like stage scenery. Now, to be fair, Nero did organize relief efforts. He opened public buildings and even his own gardens to house the homeless. Grain was imported to feed the survivors, and he issued new building codes to widen streets and encourage fireproof construction. For a moment, it almost looked like he cared. Almost. But then he unveiled his real plan. With half the city in ruins, he saw opportunity. He began construction on his dream project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a sprawling palace so massive it covered more than 100 acres, complete with artificial lakes, gardens, and rooms plated in gold. Where thousands of Romans once lived, Nero wanted fountains and theaters. The people saw it for what it was. He hadn't just let Rome burn, he had used the ashes as his blank canvas. The emperor was literally building his dream mansion on top of their misery. Of course, the public wasn't happy, so Nero needed someone to blame. And who better than the Christians? Christians were already outsiders, refusing to honor Roman gods, calling each other brothers and sisters, and gathering in secret. To many Romans, they looked suspicious, almost like a cult. Nero seized on this and declared them guilty of setting the fire. What followed was one of the most twisted, sadistic persecutions in history, and here's where Nero's dark creativity really showed. He didn't just execute Christians, he turned their deaths into public entertainment. Some were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs, ripped apart in the arena, while crowds cheered. Others were crucified along Rome's roads, their bodies left hanging as gruesome warnings. But the worst of all, the detail that still chills the soul, was how he turned human beings into torches. Christians were coated in pitch and set on fire to light up Nero's gardens during his parties. Imagine strolling through the emperor's banquet at night, the pathways glowing not with lanterns, but with burning human beings. Guests sipped wine, ate delicacies, and pretended this was normal. And in Rome, under Nero, it somehow was. Even those who despised Christians were horrified by the spectacle. Rome was a violent place, but this was a cruelty for its own sake, a sick man's stage show where suffering itself became entertainment. And the chilling part, Nero loved it. He would walk among the burning bodies as though they were nothing more than decorations for his theater of horror. The Great Fire had left Rome scarred, but Nero's response scarred it even deeper. The city could rebuild its streets and homes, but the memory of the emperor who fiddled while it burned and then turned his own citizens into torches would never fade. Rome now understood. They weren't ruled by a leader. They were ruled by a performer, an egomaniac, and above all, a sadist. By 65 AD, Nero's empire was starting to feel less like Rome and more like one giant haunted theater where the audience never knew if the next act would be a comedy or an execution. His reckless spending, endless performances, and casual murders had stretched patience thin. Even his so-called friends were starting to think, maybe we'd be better off without this guy singing love songs while the empire falls apart. That's when the Piso conspiracy hatched, a serious attempt to get rid of Nero once and for all. Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a respected senator, became the figurehead of this rebellion. Piso wasn't flashy, he wasn't dramatic. He was everything Nero wasn't: steady, dignified, and way too boring for Rome's taste. But in times of chaos, boring is better than insane. The conspirators thought Piso could restore the empire's dignity, basically trade in a drunken rock star for a sober accountant. The plot brought together a wild mix of people: senators, knights, military officers, even some members of Nero's own Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers sworn to protect him. That's how bad things had gotten. Imagine your bodyguard secretly shopping for your replacement while still smiling in your face. The plan was simple but bold. They'd assassinate Nero during the Circus Maximus Games. With the roar of the crowd covering the chaos, Piso would be declared emperor before anyone had time to rally in Nero's defense. One conspirator, Flavius Scaevinus, was even chosen to do the stabbing, hiding a dagger under his toga. This was supposed to be Rome's clean cut from madness. But like most plots against tyrants, it unraveled thanks to loose lips. A freed woman named Epicharis tried recruiting naval officers to join the plot. Bad move. One of them, scared of treason charges, ratted the whole thing out. Within hours, Nero knew, and he exploded in paranoia. Now Nero was no stranger to killing, but the conspiracy gave him something new: a reason to unleash mass murder on anyone who even looked at him the wrong way. Tortures, interrogations, accusations. Rome turned into a blood-soaked investigation. People confessed just to stop the pain, dragging more and more names into the fire. Dozens were executed, guilty or not, and then came the cruelest twist of all. Nero's old tutor, Seneca the philosopher, was accused of being involved. Seneca, the man who had tried to teach Nero about virtue, wisdom, and self-control. You know, all those things Nero trampled like a drunk elephant at a wine festival. Did Seneca actually conspire? Historians still argue, but it didn't matter. Nero had already decided. He ordered Seneca to commit suicide. The old philosopher accepted his fate with the kind of tragic dignity you'd expect from a man who spent his life writing about death. In a hot bath, he opened his veins and dictated his final thoughts to his secretary as if he were still giving a lecture. The scene was almost theatrical. Exactly the kind of thing Nero loved. The only difference? For once, Nero wasn't the one on stage. And it didn't stop there. Seneca's nephew, the poet Lucan, was also implicated. Before his death, he recited verses from his own epic poem about Rome's civil wars, turning his last breath into an act of defiance. Imagine that, a dying poet quoting his own lines, while the emperor, who fancied himself a great artist, sat in his palace, murdering the real artists out of jealousy. If that's not Roman irony, nothing is. From this point on, Nero's paranoia became unbearable. He trusted no one, not even his closest allies. Every senator, every knight, every guard could be a traitor. The court transformed into something grotesque, part theater, part torture chamber. By day, Nero would sing in silk robes, demanding applause. By night, he sent executioners into bedrooms, dragging people out half-naked to meet their deaths. It was like Rome had been cursed with a ruler who combined a pop star's ego, a serial killer's conscience, and a spoiled child's tantrums. And everyone had to play along. Senators who once debated laws now debated how loud to clap after Nero's love songs. Guards who once protected the empire now protected the emperor's fantasies. Even executions started to feel like after-dinner entertainment. And in the shadows, everyone whispered the same thing. When does this end? By now, Nero had crossed the line from dangerous ruler to something closer to a parody of madness. Rome didn't have an emperor anymore. It had a deranged celebrity trapped inside a crown. And like every egomaniac star, he wanted validation. He wanted the world to worship not just his power, but his talent. So he decided to take his greatest show on the road, a tour of Greece, not to command armies, not to negotiate treaties, not even to strengthen Rome's grip on the provinces. No, Nero wanted to compete in singing contests, acting competitions, and chariot races. The emperor of the largest empire in the world wanted to prove he was basically the Beyoncé of antiquity. Now in traditional Roman eyes, this was scandalous. Emperors were supposed to project dignity, be stoic generals, disciplined leaders, symbols of Roman power. But Nero, he was strutting on stage in glittering costumes, belting out tragic verses, and forcing entire audiences to clap like their lives depended on it. And to be fair, it did. Roman senators who traveled with him had to sit through hours of performances. If someone yawned, sneezed, or, God forbid, looked bored, Nero would stop mid-performance, glare at them, and sometimes have them dragged off for execution. Imagine being stuck in the world's deadliest open mic night, where every wrong reaction could cost you your head. The Greeks, terrified of displeasing him, gave him every prize. Nero sang, gold crown. Nero raced, another crown. Nero recited lines so badly the audience wanted to cry, standing ovation. By the end of the tour, Nero had won over 1,800 awards. He came back to Rome, swaggering like he was the greatest artist in human history, proudly displaying his trophies like a deranged Olympic champion. And here's the sick part. Nero didn't just want to perform, he wanted to be admired sexually too. He loved wearing revealing costumes, playing tragic lovers on stage, and making the whole empire watch him seduce audiences in song. Some whispered that he got aroused by the clapping itself, as if the applause was his bedroom soundtrack. In Nero's Rome, theater, sex, and power weren't separate. They were the same twisted performance. Meanwhile, while Nero was chasing applause in Greece, the empire itself was falling apart. Barbarians were pressing at the borders. Governors were struggling to keep provinces loyal. The treasury was bleeding dry, drained by Nero's endless shows, palaces, and luxuries. But Nero didn't care. Who needed armies when you had adoring crowds? Forced adoring, but still. He treated Rome less like an empire and more like his private harem of millions. He could take anyone he wanted, women, men, even boys, from any family, because what Roman dared to say no to the emperor? Husbands learned that if Nero fancied their wives, they had two choices: hand them over or risk execution. The emperor's lust was just as dangerous as his paranoia. For Nero, domination in the bedroom was just another extension of domination. And it didn't stop there. Seneca's nephew, the poet Lucan, was also implicated. Before his death, he recited verses from his own epic poem about Rome's civil wars, turning his last breath into an act of defiance. Imagine that. A dying poet quoting his own lines while the emperor, who fancied himself a great artist, sat in his palace murdering the real artists out of jealousy. If that's not Roman irony, nothing is. From this point on, Nero's paranoia became unbearable. He trusted no one, not even his closest allies. Every senator, every knight, every guard could be a traitor. The court transformed into something grotesque, part theater, part torture chamber. By day, Nero would sing in silk robes, demanding applause. By night, he sent executioners into bedrooms, dragging people out half-naked to meet their deaths. It was like Rome had been cursed with a ruler who combined a pop star's ego, a serial killer's conscience, and a spoiled child's tantrums. And everyone had to play along. Senators who once debated laws now debated how loud to clap after Nero's love songs. Guards who once protected the empire now protected the emperor's fantasies. Even executions started to feel like after-dinner entertainment, and in the shadows everyone whispered the same thing. When does this end? By now, Nero had crossed the line from dangerous ruler to something closer to a parody of madness. Rome didn't have an emperor anymore. It had a deranged celebrity trapped inside a crown. And like every egomaniac star, He wanted validation. He wanted the world to worship not just his power, but his talent. So he decided to take his greatest show on the road, a tour of Greece. Not to command armies, not to negotiate treaties, not even to strengthen Rome's grip on the provinces. No, Nero wanted to compete in singing contests, acting competitions, and chariot races. The emperor of the largest empire in the world wanted to prove he was basically the Beyoncé of antiquity. Now, in traditional Roman eyes, this was scandalous. Emperors were supposed to project dignity, be stoic generals, disciplined leaders, symbols of Roman power. But Nero, he was strutting on stage in glittering costumes, belting out tragic verses, and forcing entire audiences to clap like their lives depended on it. And to be fair, it did. Roman senators who traveled with him had to sit through hours of performances. If someone yawned, sneezed, or, God forbid, looked bored, Nero would stop mid-performance, glare at them, and sometimes have them dragged off for execution. Imagine being stuck in the world's deadliest open mic night, where every wrong reaction could cost you your head. The Greeks, terrified of displeasing him, gave him every prize. Nero sang, gold crown. Nero raced, another crown. Nero recited lines so badly the audience wanted to cry, standing ovation. By the end of the tour, Nero had won over 1,800 awards. He came back to Rome swaggering like he was the greatest artist in human history, proudly displaying his trophies like a deranged Olympic champion. And here's the sick part. Nero didn't just want to perform, he wanted to be admired sexually too. He loved wearing revealing costumes, playing tragic lovers on stage, and making the whole empire watch him seduce audiences in song. Some whispered that he got aroused by the clapping itself, as if the applause was his bedroom soundtrack. In Nero's Rome, theater, sex, and power weren't separate. They were the same twisted performance. Meanwhile, while Nero was chasing applause in Greece, the empire itself was falling apart. Barbarians were pressing at the borders. Governors were struggling to keep provinces loyal. The treasury was bleeding dry, drained by Nero's endless shows, palaces, and luxuries. But Nero didn't care. Who needed armies when you had adoring crowds, forced adoring, but still? He treated Rome less like an empire and more like his private harem of millions. He could take anyone he wanted, women, men, even boys, from any family, because what Roman dared to say no to the emperor? Husbands learned that if Nero fancied their wives, they had two choices: hand them over or risk execution. The emperor's lust was just as dangerous as his paranoia. For Nero, domination in the bedroom was just another extension of domination in politics. And the people of Rome? They were exhausted. One moment, he was singing in silk, demanding endless applause. The next, he was snatching women from their marriages like a spoiled child plucking fruit. The empire's ruler was behaving less like Augustus and more like some depraved actor drunk on his own fame. But the Greek tour marked a turning point. Nero returned believing he wasn't just emperor of Rome, he was emperor of the world's soul. He thought the gods themselves had chosen him as the greatest artist alive. To Rome, it was embarrassing. To Nero, it was destiny. He had already burned his city, murdered his family, and turned executions into entertainment. Now he was ready to remake the empire itself into his theater. And in Nero's theater, no one, not wife, not senator, not soldier, was safe from becoming part of the show. By 68 AD, the empire had reached its breaking point. Nero might have thought he was the world's greatest actor, but the provinces weren't clapping anymore. His treasury was empty, his soldiers were restless, and his constant orgies of murder, sex, and song had drained every ounce of patience from Rome. And then came the spark that would light the fire: Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul. Vindex wasn't a powerhouse general, but he was bold enough to say aloud what many were whispering: Nero has got to go. His rebellion wasn't just about taxes or politics. It was a rejection of Nero himself, the artist emperor who cared more about applause than armies, more about singing than defending borders. Imagine the shame. The ruler of Rome mocked not as a tyrant, but as a clown. Vindex's revolt encouraged others to join. The most dangerous of them, Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania. Unlike Vindex, Galba had military credibility, legions at his back, and the kind of old Roman stiffness people were craving. To Rome, Galba represented order, a father figure. To Nero, he represented the worst possible nightmare, a replacement. At first, Nero tried to respond with his usual mix of arrogance and theater. Instead of mobilizing with speed, he wasted time plotting creative punishments for the rebels, like an execution list that read more like a script. He fantasized about dragging governors naked through the streets, or worse, using their wives and daughters as props in his perverse stage plays. And remember, this was normal in Rome. Public humiliation, sexualized punishment, and grotesque executions weren't shocking. They were entertainment. Nero just pushed it to sick new levels. But reality was closing in fast. The Senate was restless. The Praetorian Guard, his supposed protectors, were sick of watching him prance around half-naked on stage while provinces slipped away. Soldiers grumbled that they weren't trained to clap. They were trained to fight. And wives of senators whispered in terror, because everyone knew that if Nero's paranoia spiked, their beds could become death traps. He had already strangled one wife, kicked another to death, and seduced countless others. At this point, Empress felt more like a death sentence than a title. Even his sexual games grew darker. Rumors spread of Nero dressing up as a bride and marrying one of his male slaves, parading around as if he were the blushing woman of the ceremony. Some whispered he even consummated the marriage publicly, turning sex into theater once again. The message was simple. Nero could be anything, take anyone, do anything. Boundaries didn't exist, and as twisted as it was, many shrugged and muttered, well, this was normal in Rome. But Galba's defiance changed everything. Here was a man the legions respected, declaring Nero unfit. That gave others permission to openly question him, and suddenly the applause Nero craved turned into silence. The same senators who once clapped until their palms bled now sat with stone faces. The same guards who once cheered his songs now whispered in the barracks about switching sides. For the first time, Nero's carefully crafted theater cracked. The man who had staged murders like plays, who had sung while his city burned, who had turned Christians into living torches, now faced an audience that no longer cared to watch. And in Rome, when the audience stopped clapping, the show was over. The emperor who thought he could seduce the world with silk, sex, and song was about to learn what happened when even Rome itself decided it had had enough. By 68 AD, the stage lights were going out. Nero, the so-called artist emperor, found himself facing the one thing he had never rehearsed for: silence. No applause, no cheers, no clapping senators pretending to adore his shrieking songs. Just silence. And in Rome, silence was deadlier than poison. The Senate, once his captive audience, finally snapped. They declared him an enemy of the state, stripping away the purple robe he loved to flaunt. For a man who lived to be worshipped, this was worse than death. One moment he was emperor, the god of song, the husband, wife, and lover of anyone he desired. The next he was nothing, naked, alone. Even the Praetorian Guard abandoned him. These were the same men who once cheered his ridiculous performances and stood guard while he seduced their wives. But loyalty can only be bought with coin or fear, and Nero had run out of both. Soldiers who once bowed to him now whispered jokes in the barracks about how their emperor preferred the stage to the battlefield, and how their wives mysteriously limped after being invited to Nero's palace. And the sick part, people muttered, this was normal in Rome. When Nero heard Galba had been declared emperor, panic set in. He stumbled through his palace like a trapped animal, muttering half-crazed questions. Where are my friends? Where are my guards? Where is my audience? But no one came. Even his lovers, his partners in orgies, slipped away like rats leaving a sinking ship. There's a grotesque irony in this moment. Here was the man who had burned Christians alive as party torches, who had turned executions into dinner entertainment, who had played husband and wife in public farces, now reduced to begging slaves for help. He even fantasized about fleeing to the east, performing in Greek theaters, still believing applause might save him. Imagine it, Rome collapsing, provinces in revolt, and Nero dreaming of encore performances in Athens. Instead, he fled the city with a handful of servants. The mighty emperor now crept through back roads, disguising himself with a cloak, terrified of being recognized. He once strutted half-naked on stage. Now he trembled at the thought of being seen at all. As he hid in a villa outside Rome, news reached him. The Senate had condemned him to death by beating, stripped naked, tied to a stake, and flogged until his body broke. For a man obsessed with appearances, this was the ultimate humiliation. He who once dressed as a bride who flaunted silk and jewels would be beaten like a slave. It was enough to break him completely. In those final hours, Nero's paranoia twisted into desperation. He begged his companions to kill him, but they refused. Even his most loyal slaves didn't want to swing the blade. So he paced, trembling, muttering to himself, asking again and again, "What an artist dies in me," as if his real tragedy wasn't the blood on his hands, but the applause he would never hear again. And here's the cruel joke of history. Rome had seen worse. To them, this was just another emperor devoured by his own madness. Husbands killed wives, wives poisoned husbands, children betrayed parents, rulers burned their cities, all normal in Rome. Nero was simply the loudest, most theatrical version of a disease that had always infected the empire. In the end, he pressed a dagger to his throat with the help of a slave. The man who sang while Rome burned, who staged his mother's murder as a play, who turned sex and death into public entertainment, died not with applause but in pathetic silence. The artist emperor finally took his last bow, not before a roaring crowd, but in a dark villa, trembling and afraid, with only a handful of servants to witness the end. Rome did not weep. Rome did not mourn. The eternal city simply shrugged, muttered this was normal in Rome, and prepared for the next act in its bloody theater. When the blade finally cut his throat, Nero collapsed into the dirt like a puppet whose strings had been severed. The so-called artist emperor didn't die on stage with roses at his feet. He died whimpering in some forgotten villa, helped along by a slave who probably wished he'd been born anywhere else. His last words? "What an artist dies in me. Not what a ruler, not what a man." Even in death, it was all about the show. And Rome? Rome barely blinked. The Senate didn't drape itself in mourning. The people didn't cry in the streets. No, they muttered what they had muttered for decades every time another madman in purple met his end. This was normal in Rome. Emperors came and went, leaving blood, smoke, and ash behind them. Nero was just another in a line of monsters. More theatrical, more sexual, more absurd, yes, but still just one more brick in Rome's wall of horrors. Yet his death wasn't the end of his story. Rumors spread almost immediately. Nero wasn't really dead. He had escaped east, they whispered, and one day he would return with an army to reclaim his throne. In taverns and back alleys, impostors popped up, wearing cloaks and strumming lyres, pretending to be the emperor risen from the grave. The irony was perfect. Nero had wanted to be an eternal performer, and now, even in death, people kept staging his encore. But for those who remembered him, the legacy was darker. This was the emperor who had murdered his stepbrother at dinner, laughed as his mother was hacked to pieces, strangled one wife and kicked another to death, and burned Christians alive to light his garden parties. He had turned Rome itself into a stage for his fantasies, where sex and death were interchangeable, and applause was worth more than human life. And yes, people shrugged and said, this was normal in Rome. His golden house still glittered in the city, obscene in its luxury, while ordinary citizens rebuilt their homes from ashes. His statues stood in the forums, staring down at the very people he had bled dry with taxes to fund his theater dreams. And his ghost, whether real or imagined, haunted Rome for generations. Some said they could still hear him singing at night, his voice echoing like a curse over the ruins he had left behind. The sexual scandals clung to his memory just as much as the murders. People whispered about the men he married while dressed as a woman, the boys he castrated to keep as lovers, the nobles' wives he summoned to his bed like playthings. For Nero, sex was never intimacy. It was domination, humiliation, performance. In his Rome, no body was sacred. Husbands lost wives, wives lost husbands, children lost innocence, and everyone learned to say the same phrase to survive. This was normal in Rome. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. Nero wasn't an alien. He wasn't a freak accident. He was the product of an empire that rewarded cruelty, where betrayal was family tradition, where poisoners were celebrities, and where lust and murder were entertainment. Nero was just Rome's ugliest mirror, reflecting back the darkness everyone already knew was there. When news of his death finally spread, some celebrated, some shrugged, and some feared he would rise again. But for the empire, the lesson was carved in blood. Emperors could be gods, monsters, or clowns, and sometimes, like Nero, all three at once. The stage was cleared, the actor was gone, but the horror he performed would echo through history forever. Because in Rome, cruelty wasn't the exception, it was the rule. And no matter how shocking, no matter how grotesque, no matter how sexual or absurd, everyone knew the truth. This was normal in Rome.